the urban skills, and that meant economic and business and trade skills, that would make it the capital that he wanted to have.
New craftsmen brought new skills. Silk from the early Ottoman capital Bursa, along with wool, goat hair, and cotton, were woven together into intricate carpets that became the Ottomans' most famous export. In 1465, the 33-year-old Sultan Mehmet II began work on the crown jewel of his new city, the extraordinary Topkapi Palace.
Topkapi Palace should be thought of as a gigantic household consisting of concentric circles of power, the outermost circle being the least powerful. And as you get closer to the center of the palace, you get closer to the person of the Sultan, and therefore closest to the locus of power. It was intended to be both a symbol of power, but also the actual place of power.
The massive 173-acre complex would ultimately include 10 mosques, 2 hospitals, 5 schools, 12 libraries, and 22 marble fountains.
What you see in the background here are the chimneys of the kitchens. One of the things that I always think about when I look at those chimneys is that we call it a palace, but it was really a city. We have the registers of the food purchased and the cost and the amounts. At least 5,000 people a day were fed here. So this was a massive operation.
Topkapi Palace was, in fact, a city within the larger city of Istanbul. Mehmet governed both in royal fashion.
He took over much of the trappings of the Byzantine emperors, of the Eastern Roman Empire. The bread that the sultans ate came from a very special wheat grown in 2 villages in Bursa. And even as late as the 17th century, in the old palace in Bursa, there were 200 janissaries whose entire job in life was to sort through the flour, make sure there were no impurities, and send so many 100 pounds of this a week wherever the Sultan was.
The Sultan ordered 2 mountain villages to supply ice year-round for Topkapi.
Once a week, 200 donkey loads of ice would go down to the sea, be sent to Istanbul to cool the sherbet served at the meals in the palace here.
Mehmet's religious tolerance and his broad interests in art and commerce transformed Istanbul into the vibrant new center of the Islamic world.
He surrounded himself with Byzantine historians, philosophers, writers, diplomats. He was interested in many of the things that his contemporaries in Europe were interested in. He was, I guess, as close as I can think of to a sort of Ottoman Renaissance man as one can imagine.
But his civic interest didn't alter Mehmet's military goals or aggressiveness. Rebuilding Istanbul required money, and new conquests generated new revenues. For 25 years, he waged war against the Christian territories, pushing the outer boundaries of the empire into Romania, Albania, and Bosnia, and dominated his enemies. His primary goal was to conquer Christian lands, then subdue them and tax them.
He pushed very hard. He's in some ways a kind of Napoleon-like figure. I mean, he very definitely is a dynamic and decisive military man who also has a lot of ideas that spill over in other respects.
After an extraordinary 30-year reign, Mehmet the Conqueror died of natural causes on May 3rd, 1481. He was 49. Mehmet had reinvented the empire, but he had also left it somewhat exhausted. After years of constant military campaigns, the Janissaries were tired and growing mutinous. Islamic religious leaders were also angry. They resented the Sultan's attempts to assert his authority in what were traditionally religious matters.
He was also a person with too much voltage. By the end of his reign, there was a real demand for a relaxation from his over-aggressive policies and a move back towards stricter Islamic norms.
This struggle for control within the Islamic faith would plague Mehmet's successors. The Ottomans were heading for violent and enduring clashes within the Islamic world. After Mehmet the Conqueror's death in 1481, the Ottoman Empire enjoyed a period of relative tranquility under his son Bayezid II. But Bayezid's peaceful nature and cautious approach proved to be his undoing. His sons argued for a more aggressive and forceful policy. In 1512, his son Selim won the support of the Janissaries and forced his father to abdicate. Selim's reign began brutally, even by the standards of Ottoman succession. Some historians believe Selim poisoned his father. He then ordered his 2 brothers and 5 nephews killed.
Selim had come to power and maintained power by sheer force and force of personality, and was quite unhesitant to utilize violence. He was also a man who ruled by fear.
All Ottoman rulers had nicknames, and they sometimes are quite telling. Selim is Yavuz, which means grim or mean. He probably got that nickname because he is the Ottoman ruler who turns against the older Islamic states.
Islamic law prohibits Muslims fighting Muslims, but Sultan Selim claimed other Middle Eastern rulers were heretics and went on the attack. By 1517, Selim's army had swept through Iran, Syria, Lebanon, and Egypt, capturing the holy cities of Jerusalem, Mecca, and Medina. These conquests earned him the title of Caliph, meaning head of Islam.
Up until that time, the people they ruled were overwhelmingly Christian. It's now that, for the first time, a majority of their population were Muslim. And of course, the conquest or the incorporation of the holy cities of Mecca, Medina, and Jerusalem for the Ottomans was a prestige factor. This allowed them to see themselves and be viewed by others as the leading Islamic dynasty.
But Selim didn't live to enjoy his prestigious position. In 1520, just 8 years after becoming Sultan, he died suddenly of an infection.
Had he lived, later Ottoman lore held that he would clearly have become Sahib Quran, that is, a world conqueror who had never been defeated in battle. He was likened to Alexander.
In his short, violent reign, Selim had doubled the size of the Ottoman Empire and assumed leadership of the entire Muslim world. At the time of Selim's death, his only son, Suleiman, was the governor of Manisa province. With no brothers to battle, it was a rare instance of peaceful succession. Suleiman would go on to become the empire's greatest sultan, earning the name Suleiman the Magnificent. 16th century Europe was dominated by young and dynamic leaders. England's Henry VIII, Francis I of France, the Habsburgs' Charles V, and Russia's Ivan the Terrible. Suleiman saw himself as a major player in this world and set out to prove it. Taking the throne at age 26, he immediately launched his first military campaign.
Suleiman took it upon himself immediately to establish his own reputation as a ghazi, as a warrior for the faith. Suleiman was able to establish himself as a commander with whom to be reckoned.
Suleiman's army, led by the Janissaries, pushed deep into the heart of Europe. The city of Belgrade fell in August of 1521. The next year, Suleiman's navy captured the island of Rhodes. Suleiman kept on the attack. In 1526, his army first entered and sacked Hungarian capital of Buda. 3 years later, his troops pushed all the way to the gates of Vienna. The Ottomans were now a force in European affairs. To expand the empire further, Suleiman knew he needed a stronger navy.
the Ottomans are engaged in a fundamental battle with Spain for control of the Mediterranean. So there is a major superpower battle going on throughout the 16th century for mastery of the Mediterranean. And the Ottomans needed the very best naval commander that they could get.
Suleiman offered one of the Mediterranean's most feared pirates, then called corsairs, the role of admiral of his fleet. His name was Haradim Barbarossa.
This is very, very typical of the Ottoman ability to take people on the ground who had some native talent and then turn them to their own uses. And throughout Ottoman history, if you were enough of an outlaw, if you made enough trouble for the Ottomans, eventually they'd decide to appoint you to a government post, because better to have you on their side than to be making trouble for you.
Barbarossa, with the backing of Suleiman, built a fleet of 200 ships. Within several years, this new navy helped create one of the largest empires in history, stretching across 3 continents from Russia through Eastern Europe, the Middle East, and into North Africa. Along with his military prowess, Suleiman was also a shrewd politician. When the Reformation split the Christian church in Europe into Catholic and Protestant, Suleiman took the side of the Protestants.
The Ottomans favored Protestantism to the extent that they did, precisely because their traditional enemies were Catholic countries. So it was based on politics rather than some sort of assessment of dogma.
Suleiman's backing and financial support proved crucial. Some historians even claimed that the Protestant movement might have failed without Suleiman's support.
Suleiman, of course, was very much concerned about his public image, and he wanted to be known as one of the, perhaps the greatest leaders of his own age. One way to do this was to conquer, capture all these territories, defeat your enemies. Another way of doing this is to make Istanbul, the capital of this mighty Turkish Ottoman Empire, beautiful.
In Istanbul, Suleiman launched a cultural and architectural revival to match that of the European Renaissance. Topkapi Palace was refashioned into the grand style of a European king. The court adopted the ceremonial style of European royalty. He called on a janissary named Mimar Sinan to create mosques and public buildings throughout the empire. Sinan was trained as a military engineer, building arsenals, bridges, and aqueducts, and he proved to be an architectural genius. Over a 40-year period, he designed and built 79 mosques, 34 palaces, 19 tombs, and more than 60 other significant monuments and buildings.
In a sense, Mimar Sinan played an important role in the public relations policy of Sultan Suleiman. He created all these structures to demonstrate the glory of Ottoman Empire and Sultan Suleiman's reign.
To the Europeans, he became known as Suleiman the Magnificent, but to his own people, he was called Kanuni, the lawgiver. Suleiman developed a legal system based on precedent and case law that was consistent with the sacred law of Islam. He also insisted that all new laws be compatible with Western Christian tradition.
Suleiman is known as the lawgiver because he presided over an unprecedented codification of law.
But among all of Suleiman's adopted Western ways, nothing proved more significant than the simple act of falling in love and getting married. Suleiman's marriage not only reshaped his reign, it would alter the course of Ottoman history for the next century. Sultan Suleiman's decision to marry for love was unprecedented and shocking. For over a century, the Ottoman monarchy had relied on slave concubines, not wives, for the production of heirs. This traditional Islamic approach had practical advantages. It produced a steady supply of princes, and unlike European monarchies that were easily derailed by one barren generation, the Ottoman dynasty survived, uninterrupted, for centuries. The system of the imperial harem with its own rules worked, and the rules did not include marriage.